Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're diving into Nigeria at 64. On the surface, it might seem like just another Independence Day, another year older, but we're going deeper than that. We've got some compelling source material here, and we're going to unpack what this anniversary really means, the highs, the lows, all of it.
Yeah, it's about tracing that whole journey from colonial rule to present-day Nigeria.
Asa.
Well, let's just say it's full of surprises.
And uncovering those surprises, that's what we do best here. And speaking of surprises, our sources really capture this incredible sense of pride and excitement surrounding Nigeria's independence back in 1960. And let me tell you, it wasn't some easy process. We're talking a hard-fought battle against British rule with some seriously remarkable figures leading the way.
And you can't truly grasp the enormity of that moment without wrapping your head around what was going on globally at the time. Picture this. The Berlin Conference, where Africa was basically carved up by European powers. Fast forward to the 1950s, and you've got people like Anthony Enahoro bravely standing up in 1953, demanding self-governance. The world was watching to see if Nigeria could actually break free.
And break free they did. But, and this is key, our sources make it clear that even though Britain eventually stepped back, it's not like their influence just vanished overnight. It's more like this lingering presence, shaping things even after they were physically gone.
It's that complex process of disentangling from the systems and structures left behind by colonizers. It's something many former colonies grapple with.
Absolutely. But here's where the strength of the Nigerian people shines through. The source talks about their incredible resilience. Think about it. Surviving a civil war, navigating that incredibly intense June 12th crisis, these events could have torn a nation apart. But instead, they revealed this profound sense of unity among Nigerians.
It speaks volumes about their hope for a brighter future. But, and there's always a but, right? The source also throws us a bit of a curveball. They bring up population growth. Since independence, Nigeria's population has just exploded. Now, typically that signals progress, but it also brings a whole new set of challenges to the table.
It's like a double-edged sword, right? More people, more potential, but also a lot more to handle in terms of resources, infrastructure, even just the way you think about governing a nation. It makes you wonder, how do you effectively provide for such a large and diverse population, especially given the pre-existing economic and social hurdles?
It really is a balancing act. And you know what? Our sources, they don't shy away from the difficulties Nigeria faces. They get right to it, using some pretty strong language at times.
They don't mince words, that's for sure. I remember one quote that really jumped out at me: Nigeria is not working. And then there's that striking image of the nation as a crippled giant. Powerful stuff.
Yeah, that metaphor is meant to be a wake-up call, not an insult. It highlights this gap between Nigeria's incredible potential, right? All the natural resources, the vibrant people, and then the realities on the ground. The source argues that it's things like economic mismanagement, corruption, and this heavy reliance on imports, even for the most basic goods, that are holding the nation back.
Seriously. It's almost hard to believe, but the source even talks about Nigeria importing toothpicks. Toothpicks? It sounds kind of funny at first, but then you realize, wow, this points to a much bigger issue, this dependence on outside forces for things they could easily be producing themselves. And that's where the conversation gets really interesting, because it delves into this whole concept of neocolonialism.
Ah, neocolonialism. The subtler, sneakier relative of traditional colonialism. You see, it's not about physically occupying a country anymore. It's about these intricate systems like international institutions, trade agreements, the influence of these massive multinational corporations.
It's almost like there are these puppet masters pulling strings from a distance. And speaking of puppet masters, the source really calls out this group they call the oil mafia, this shadowy force that supposedly controls a lot of Nigeria's oil wealth. And that makes it nearly impossible for Nigeria to refine its own oil, to control its own energy future.
Right. It's this tangled web. And the oil mafia is like a prime example of how neocolonialism plays out in reality. And to really illustrate this, the source tells the story of this Nigerian entrepreneur. He had this vision of establishing an oil refinery in Nigeria.
Right, I remember that. He wanted to create jobs, boost the economy, really make a difference from the ground up. But it wasn't exactly smooth sailing, was it?
Not even close.
No.
This guy encountered obstacle after obstacle, and the source strongly implies that these were not just random roadblocks.
It's like there were forces working against him, trying to maintain control over Nigeria's resources. Which brings us right back to that theme of neocolonialism, this system where achieving true economic and political independence, the kind envisioned by those who fought so hard for Nigeria's freedom, it remains this elusive goal.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue, and it's tempting to think that these external pressures are the only problem. But our sources go deeper than that. They also shed light on the deep divisions within Nigeria itself. There's this really interesting comparison to Rwanda.
That caught my attention too. What did you make of that?
Well, they talk about the horrific Rwandan genocide, obviously, but then they highlight the commitment to unity and reconciliation that emerged afterwards. They seem to admire Rwanda's efforts to forge a unified national identity, something they say Nigeria has struggled with, despite its own difficult past.
And it all comes down to these ingrained ethnic and religious divisions, right?
No.
The source points out how these divisions often contribute to political instability, conflicts over resources, and it just creates this feeling of a never-ending cycle.
It's like a pressure cooker. And the source really digs into a specific pressure point, the federal character principle. Now, on paper, it sounds great. It's about ensuring representation for all of Nigeria's diverse ethnic groups, which is important, right? But the source argues that the way it's been implemented in practice hasn't always been fair, and sometimes it's been manipulated to create a system that actually favors certain groups over others.
So instead of promoting unity, it ends up fueling resentment and a sense of marginalization.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more complicated, because some people believe these internal divisions are actually being exploited intentionally or not to prevent Nigeria from truly controlling its own destiny. It's like this vicious cycle fueled by both internal and external factors.
Wow, talk about a complicated situation. It makes you wonder, where do we even go from here? I mean, with all these challenges on the table, does the source offer any hope? Any potential solutions? They're not exactly sugarcoating things, so I'm curious to know if they propose any ways forward.
Yeah, so it's not like a simple fix, is it? I mean, where do you even begin to address all of this? Do they offer any solutions?
Well, they definitely don't shy away from tough love, that's for sure.
Yeah.
They use this phrase, and it's stuck with me. They call it a bitter pill. Like, it's time to stop messing around with temporary fixes and get to the root of the problem.
Bitter pill. Wow, okay. I can see why that would stick with you. It sounds like they're calling for some major changes. But what does that actually look like? What kind of bitter pill are we talking about here? One of the big ideas they put forward is restructuring the government. And they're not just talking about it in some vague sense. They specifically suggest that Nigeria might want to explore a parliamentary system as opposed to the current presidential structure. They seem to think it could lead to more accountability, better cooperation between different regions.
That's interesting because you hear that word restructuring thrown around a lot, but it's usually pretty nebulous. This is a much more concrete proposal.
It is. And they back it up by pointing to something pretty fascinating that happened in Nigeria back in 2014, that national conference they had.
Oh, yeah, vaguely I remember hearing about it, but I'll be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the specifics. What was that all about again?
So they had this massive gathering of people from all walks of life, all parts of Nigeria, to basically hash out a vision for the country's future. And they didn't just talk. They actually came up with a bunch of recommendations for change of the Constitution, political reforms, a potential roadmap for real change. But, and this is the frustrating part, according to the source, a lot of those recommendations were just ignored.
Wait, so they're saying this conference, it could have been this pivotal moment for Nigeria, a chance to really tackle some of these deep-rooted problems head on, but it just fizzled out.
That's the argument, yeah. They see it as a missed opportunity, a moment where things could have shifted but ultimately didn't. It's kind of heartbreaking in a way.
It really makes you wonder, what if they had actually acted on those recommendations? Could it have put Nigeria on a different path? One where they break free from this cycle of corruption and division, the neocolonial influences we talked about? It's a lot to process.
It really is. And that's what makes this duck dive so powerful, I think. We're not just celebrating Nigeria at 64. We're really grappling with complexities of what this anniversary means, the good, the bad, and everything in between. It's about asking those tough questions. What does true independence actually look like? Can a nation truly thrive when it's carrying the weight of these internal divisions, these external pressures? And most importantly, how do you even begin to overcome those challenges?
Man, those are some big questions, and it's not like there's one easy answer, but I think you're right. Just having these conversations, shining a light on these issues, that's a crucial first step, right? Even if it's uncomfortable sometimes.
100%. And at the end of the day, it's not about pointing fingers. It's about recognizing that the responsibility to create a better future for Nigeria, it doesn't fall on one person's shoulders. It rests on all Nigerians coming together, finding that collective will to move forward.
It's like they're at this crossroads, and they have the power to choose their own path. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something for everyone listening to think about. Can a nation ever truly break free from those internal and external constraints, to really reach its full potential? Or are those constraints just an inherent part of its DNA?
It's a question that will probably continue to be debated for years to come, but it's definitely a question worth pondering, especially as we reflect on Nigeria at 64 and beyond.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, that wraps up our deep dive for today. A huge thank you to everyone for joining us, and a special thanks to you for lending your expertise. It's always a pleasure to have these conversations. Until next time.